Would you pay extra to keep poison out of your eggs? I had to face this exact question this week. The feed mill told me that if I wanted to keep a toxic additive out of our feed, it was going to cost me an extra $100 per ton. I filmed a video on this exact topic last year, and here we are again. Toxic fake orange egg yolks exposed again. When I placed my feed order this week, the feed mill told me if I wanted my feed delivered to me without a toxin, it was going to cost me $100 more per ton. This floored me because just a few months ago, I was told that a toxin or feeds containing a toxin that had it as an additive was not even going to be an issue anymore because it was just going to be completely removed. So I was on the phone with our feed supplier this morning, and I found out that they're going to be removing a toxin called a toxin that's actually a synthetic antioxidant that's put into feed as a preservative. Now, for those of you that have been ordering from Harvest Hills Ranch, don't worry, I've been on top of this from the outset, and this hasn't been in any of our feeds. Yet, here we are again, and nothing has changed. Here's why this matters to you. Even if you don't own chickens, you never intend to own a chicken, this is why it's important to you. Because a toxin isn't just in the feed, it's in the eggs you're eating. You've probably been told to look for deep orange yolks when buying eggs. Supposedly that means that they're healthier. But here's the truth. Farmers are adding coloring agents to the feed to change the color of those egg yolks to that deep orange. And those additives often contain a toxin. That orange yolk isn't a byproduct of increased sunshine, available grasses, and beautiful lush pasture. It's from a chemical that gets added to things like marigold, cayenne, and paprika. I've never allowed a toxin containing feed on my ranch, but some farms that even call themselves regenerative are using it because they know orange yolks sell. It's a false presentation, and it tricks well-meaning consumers like you. I've even literally had conversations with other farmers. I can remember one in particular being at the processing center, and these individuals intentionally acknowledging that they will only buy feed that has coloring agents added to it because they want to have that presentation for their customers. Now, you might think that for something that gets labeled as a synthetic antioxidant, a toxin's not a big deal. After all, antioxidant generally has a positive mindset associated with it. However, there's a much different story behind the scenes, and this is what other farms, other producers that are allowing coloring agents into their eggs are not acknowledging. When you look at a toxin, there's a lot of data out there on a toxin, solid data, not just random stuff that somebody generated up and threw online somewhere. This is solid, rigorous scientific study that we're talking about here. So what has actually been associated with a toxin? Well, let me take you through a buildup of this information. I just want to share a couple of highlights to you of what's been seen around these negative effects. One thing that's been noticed is DNA damage in the immune system cells of humans. Part of the reason that a toxin does this is because it damages the DNA. It increases the free radicals. So ironically, it's increasing the free radicals that it inherently should be offsetting. Down the road, those are becoming more prevalent as this chemical stays in the system longer. Cells that should otherwise just naturally die off and be eliminated from the body, that ability to perform that process is interfered with. And there's specific tissues that have even been targeted. For example, the kidneys, the liver, the bladder, these are all tissues that have been targeted. And what we have seen is that there's been evidence that has been generated just in the laboratory. There's been evidence that has been generated in various animal models, specifically in rat models here. And some would argue on this, yeah, but you don't have any evidence of this in human studies. Well, here's the problem with that is no one is going to sign off on exposing someone to a chemical to see whether or not that chemical is dangerous to them, especially when that chemical has already got a evidence base behind it that shows that it's a problem. But even with that being said, let's not just push that whole human element aside for a moment because there are clearly case reports showing that occupational environmental exposure to a toxicant has initiated dermatitis. So clearly, if that chemical is on your skin and enough of it's there, it's going to cause a problem. So when you look at this escalating problem throughout from the laboratory through different species and from what human data from exposure points that we have, Ethoxyquin's a real issue here. So why would we even consider putting it in the feed that our animals are consuming that is ultimately going to work its way up through the food chain? This isn't a neutral additive in the feed. It's a toxin. Now, some of you may look at this and say, well, really problematic, maybe, maybe not. Here's what I would ask you to compare this against. This is a great analogy, and you'll see why more so even in a moment. But for those of you that are familiar with glyphosate, the primary active ingredient in Roundup, glyphosate was initially seen as not that big of an issue either. And look at the data that we now have with glyphosate. We see that there are lawsuits that have been filed and individuals have won in court illustrating that exposure to glyphosate has been associated with chronic disease, a number of chronic diseases out there. I'll refrain from naming those at the moment, but you can get a pretty good idea of what those are. The other point here is that glyphosate, two things come to mind for me here. Glyphosate was introduced by Monsanto, and it was originally introduced as a compound that was not related to the agriculture market. Well, oddly enough, ethoxyquin checks a lot of these same boxes. If you're looking at ethoxyquin, it was introduced by Monsanto in the 1950s. It was originally used to prevent rubber from breaking down as quickly when it's exposed to the elements. And by the time you got around to the 1960s, what do you know? It had been labeled as to be used in agriculture again. And the way that it's used in agriculture, apart from just being a food additive, is that it's used to prevent what's called storage scald in apples and pears. This is something that develops when those apples and pears are being used in or being held in storage. And so ethoxyquin is applied to those to prevent that from happening. And to be able to do that, and here's the kicker, guys, to be able to do that, in 1965, it had to undergo registration as a U.S. pesticide. Now, there's one other similarity related to glyphosate that I think you have to acknowledge here, and that is not just that glyphosate is a problem, but that the breakdown byproducts of glyphosate are just as problematic. This is abbreviated AMPA in the case of glyphosate. Well, what do you know? It turns out that ethoxyquin, in and of itself being toxic, also has breakdown products that are in and of themselves toxic. So this is not simply just a synthetic antioxidant that's sitting in the feed that is supposedly being used to preserve these coloring agents that are being added. This is a molecule that was introduced into the marketplace for one reason, but has found its way into the agriculture space, and ultimately, just as in the case of glyphosate, this molecule is causing and has the ability to continuously cause small amounts of consistent accumulation, which is really where these compounds start to create their problems at. Here's the question you have to answer. Where are you being exposed to ethoxyquin at without even knowing it? Well, when you look at how it sneaks into your diet, there are a couple of avenues here. I've mentioned the poultry feed, and I will have more to say about that, but it comes in with the poultry feed, which ends up in your eggs that you're consuming. If you're consuming farm-raised fish, it's in the fish meal that those animals are being fed. When you look at pets, if you read the labels on pet food sometimes, even the ones that are quote-unquote healthy pet foods, they're going to add ethoxyquin in there under this pretense that it's a synthetic antioxidant or a synthetic preservative. but it's still in there and it still doesn't erase any of the concerns that I've shared with you about it. Here's the biggest catch on this. You're not going to see a toxicant on the label. Especially when you're talking about eggs, which is the main topic of our conversation today, they're not putting a toxicant on that label because inherently they know somebody's going to do exactly what I'm doing today, which is go and start looking all that stuff up and realize that I don't recognize that name, that can't be good, and ultimately draw the same conclusions that I've drawn from this database. But you're quietly being exposed without your consent, and that should infuriate you. And if it doesn't, then you know what? This video, or maybe even my whole channel, is probably not for you. But if that does infuriate you, then yeah, let's get on board and let's acknowledge that you don't need to be fixating on these eggs that have these beautiful, bright orange yolks associated with them. That is not reality. And in fact, I want to draw this to your attention. This is probably a good time to do this. I, like I said, I've never brought feed onto the ranch that has a toxicant in it. So I have a really good understanding of what quality yolks look like from our laying flock. And a quality yolk should have a rich yellow appearance to it. To me, you have three types of egg yolk. So if, as a consumer, if you're looking at, well, how do I differentiate? Here's how you differentiate. If there's that bright orange color, it's got a coloring agent added into it, and you're not seeing the true appearance of that egg yolk. And that also should irritate you as a consumer, that you're not being allowed to see the reality of what that bird should be producing based on the environment that they're in. So that's option number one. Option number two is that you should have a rich, vibrant yellow
Animals
yolk,
raised
not
in a more
orange,
open environment
yellow
setting as
yolk.
opposed to a
And the
confined setting,
third is
because
that
that
you have
animal
this
is more
really
free to do
pale
its normal
yellow
activities,
yolk. It
and its
doesn't have the
inherent
vibrancy
eating pattern
associated with it.
is going to be more
The second
dialed in
option that I
when
gave
it's
you here
in that
is what you're
environment.
looking for. You're looking for rich, vibrant yellow yolks. You will hear, and I've heard this numerous times, and this is just absolutely incorrect. You will hear influencers all the time showing their ignorance about not having any idea of what goes into raising animals, especially in a pastured environment. Chickens being the main focus here. Because they will say you should go out and you should seek out these bright orange yolks. That's nonsense. At this moment in the year, I have the most lush pastures that our birds could possibly be on. They're full of color. Even in the spring, this didn't change where we had all the new growth in the spring. You have tons of different colors in that pasture landscape. And here we are in late summer, and I've still got these lush pastures. There's all these carotenoids in the grasses, in the forbs, in what many individuals would call weeds that those birds are eating. They have that therapeutic medicinal aspect for them. But you know what's happened to the egg yolk? They're just bright yellow. They're that rich, vibrant yellow. They're not going to turn orange. Anytime you see orange yolks, you should have a red flag going off in your head that I am being lied to. This is being misrepresented to me. And for those that keep pushing that line of thought, that keep pushing that message, you should stop inherently listening to those individuals because they don't know what they're talking about. And it is really no more black and white than that. If you have the opportunity to walk those pastures day in and day out and literally feed your family the byproduct of what you know is quality effort to raise these animals in the most opportune environment that they could flourish in, and it still doesn't generate this orange yolk, it is a massive indicator that that is not what is supposed to be produced by this animal. It is supposed to be a bright, yellow, rich yolk. And carrying this line of thought and carrying this message that a bright yolk, a bright orange yolk, equates to better nutrition, it does not. And that is not solely my opinion. You've got other institutions that have said the same thing. I remember looking at one when I was researching this, South Dakota State University, very reputable institution, says the exact same thing. So again, this is not solely my opinion here. Here's what we want to note with this, and this is what you as the consumer, because I don't like to just dump a problem in your lap and not give you a solution. But I do dump problems in your lap, so to say, so that you can understand the reality and why I push you so hard to grab a hold of the solution and actually take action with it. You are not in the defenseless position that it may initially appear. But if you don't have the education behind you to ask about a toxiquin or even know that a toxiquin is a risk factor for you, you're going to get blindsided. You're giving away your consent unknowingly to be exposed to toxins. Every time you eat those orange yolks, you're eating a toxin. You're eating a toxin you never agreed to buy. Would you go and intentionally pick up eggs, whether at the farmer's market or whether at the grocery store or wherever you purchase those eggs from? Would you intentionally buy those eggs if you knew there was a toxin in them? Absolutely not. So here's the solution. Don't chase yolk color. Stop doing that. That is not going to provide you any long-term benefit. There's no additional nutritional quality there. You're looking for rich, vibrant yellow yolks. That's what color they should be. Don't consume the pale ones, right? And the pale yolks are pretty much what you see as your conventional raised egg layers. If you're just buying the cheapest eggs at the grocery store, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get those pale yolks. And those animals aren't being raised in an optimal environment. But if you're looking at pasture raised, optimal environment, bright yellow is what we're going for, okay? Buy directly, here's the next tip, buy directly from producers who never use a toxiquin. Well, how do I know if they use a toxiquin or not? Ask them. Ask the question. And here's what you should also ask. Because I guarantee you most of the producers that you ask this question of aren't even going to know what you're talking about. And this is going to be for you to educate them. The next question you have to ask, if they don't know what a toxiquin is do they add a coloring agent or do they allow a coloring agent to be added to the feed that they're feeding their poultry? If they do, you've got a follow-up question to ask. So the third question here is, does that coloring agent, is it an organic, a toxiquin free, or does it not? And they may or may not know the answer to that. You're going to have to get those answers and find that reassurance. And someone who is really producing food with your best interest in mind should know these answers. They should emphatically know these answers. And if they don't, then you, as the consumer, have to ask, why am I putting so much trust into this individual? And I can assure you, and I'm talking to you, the consumer, for a minute here, I can assure you that the producers, the farmers and ranchers that are listening to this, that are getting upset with me right now, shame on you guys, because you are not doing your due diligence for your consumers and you're not standing behind what your mission and message is. You're allowing the industry to dictate to you what should go into a feed versus actually doing what is right by the consumer and keeping that product, keeping that toxin out of their feed. And if you don't know those answers in your own feed, shame on you for not doing that due diligence and saying that you're holding yourself to a higher standard when you're actually not doing that. The third tip that I have for you here is avoid farm fish. There's really no way to know if that's a toxiquin free or not. You're not going to be able to ask the questions. You're not going to be able to follow up on that trail of transparency because there is no trail of transparency here. So just buy wild caught and move on. Spices, I didn't mention this one. Spices are another place you can run into a toxiquin. They'll put this on the label. So just read those labels, make sure you're avoiding that. If you're going to eat things like apples and pears, peel those. That's predominantly where you're going to see that residue is going to be sitting on those skin, so peel those. And the one of these that really just is so irritating to me is going to be pet foods. This is just taking advantage of these defenseless animals, and we're exposing them to things. For example, they'll throw fish meal in there, and with the fish meal, they'll add the toxiquin along with that. They could easily replace that with things like mixed tocopherols or rosemary extract that do the same thing as these synthetic antioxidants. You could use the non-synthetic antioxidant options and get the same outcomes of protecting that food ingredient without the damage and the risk of exposure of a toxic compound. You, as a consumer, this is my last tip for you, you've got to be skeptical. And When you look at an orange yolk like that, your alarm bells, your red flags, they should go off. They should be screaming in your head that this orange yolk is not better because of everything that I've just shared with you in this video. Egg yolk color, that should come from the chicken's natural diet out on pasture, not a chemical shortcut. At Harvest Hills Ranch, we've never allowed a toxic additive like a toxaquin in our feed, and we're never going to. And I'm always going to keep pushing back on those that suggest that it's okay to put these coloring agents in there that contain these toxic additives like a toxaquin. I will always push back against that because it is in your interest as the consumer to never have exposure to that. If you want eggs and chicken that's raised the way nature intended, well, that's exactly what we provide at Harvest Hills Ranch. And this isn't the only hidden trick that the food industry is pulling on you. Click on this next video to watch how they're also misleading you with food labels that are setting you up for failure.